Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I am your host TJ Mabardi. We are coming to you live on Monday afternoon. Today is September 30th and we have a whole lot of NFL action to break down. Today we're going to be talking about some of the biggest storylines coming out of this past weekend. The Ravens blowing out the Bills on Sunday Night Football. What does that mean for both of those teams? The Chiefs overcome a slow start but see an injury to Rashee, which could alter their season. We'll be talking about that. And then as well, some of the other games as well that we're going to be hitting on is the New York Jets failing to score a touchdown in their loss to the Denver Broncos. Is this a red flag moving forward for them? The Vikings pick up a win on the road in Lambeau Field against the division rival Packers. And we will be talking about whether or not this race for the NFC North actually does run through Minnesota. And then to finish off the show, we of course have to dive into the news that broke over the weekend in the NBA that the New York Knicks are acquiring All-Star center Karl-Anthony Towns in a move that could entirely alter the seasons ahead for two championship contenders in the Knicks and the Timberwolves. So we're going to be breaking all of that down. A whole lot to dive into today. But before we get into all of that, just want to remind you to like, follow, subscribe wherever you may be keeping up with us. If you are in the comment section live here, be sure to use the chat to give us your thoughts on the latest happenings in sports, your thoughts on this past weekend, whether it be in the NFL or maybe in the NBA on this Towns trade as well. As we have a whole lot to get into, we want to hear what you have to say as we try and make this show as interactive as possible. So feel free to use the comment section to give us your thoughts or questions, or if you would like to become a bigger part of the show, you can use the super chat feature that is available on YouTube by clicking the $sign. If you leave a tip or donation along with a comment, your comment will pop up on screen for everyone to see. Anything would be very greatly appreciated there. We're going to start off our NFL talk of the day breaking down what we saw last night from the Sunday Night Football matchup between the Baltimore Ravens and the Buffalo Bills, two of the best teams in the NFL, two of the Super Bowl contenders, and really, especially in this AFC, a little bit of a positioning for one another, considering they both are going to ideally want to have home field advantage come around the playoffs, and these are two teams that could be vying for that potential, maybe not number one seed, but still at the top of the AFC, and it is the Ravens coming out and at home dominating the Buffalo Bills. So we'll start on the Ravens side here because this really was, I thought it was to some degree against Dallas last week, but this was sort of the coming out party for the Ravens in terms of the fact that this is just very clearly who they are going to be for the remainder of the year, which is ground and pound using Derrick Henry and Lamar Jackson, and just it's a combination of outsizing, outspeeding as well. I mean, you look at the breakaway, Derrick Henry on the first snap of the game rushes for an 87-yard touchdown. It's a combination of the physicality but also the finesse that does lie within this team. And last night they were excellent in the run game once again. Derrick Henry, 24 carries, 199 yards, and a touchdown. You have Lamar getting it done himself as well, 54 yards and a touchdown on the ground there. And this is back-to-back weeks where the Ravens really haven't needed to incorporate all that much of the pass game, and yet when they have needed to, Lamar Jackson has come through for the most part. 13 of 18, 156 yards, and 2 touchdowns. It's maybe not necessarily numbers that are going to help Lamar Jackson in an MVP race, but at this point, he's already got a couple to his name. That's really not where his concern is at. It's about maximizing the talent of this roster, and that is in the trenches, running the ball and being able to wear down opposing defenses, which is what they've done up to this point in the season, and especially so over the course of these past 2 weeks. And I think it would have been maybe a little bit concerning if the Ravens went away from this. We'll be diving into the Eagles probably tomorrow is when we're going to talk about that game. But I thought that the abandoning after Saquon Barkley showing that he really should be the identity of that offense, going away from it, I think is a little bit of a bad reflection on the coaching staff. In this game, the Ravens, they just saw how much success they had last week against the Cowboys, that they wanted to replicate that, and they did, especially against a defense in the Bills that are without both of their starting linebackers. There's still so much, and we keep talking about it week after week. I promise, as the season goes on here, that at some point it's just going to be who they are. But it is still early in the year, and the Bills have such a different identity defensively this season in comparison to what they had last year, just based on the change in personnel. And they are still sort of finding themselves. They've played very well up to this point, specifically the secondary, in terms of being able to limit opponents, and they haven't really had to force themselves to get stops to stay in a game because the offense has looked so good on the other side that the Bills have been the ones sort of jumping out on top. I know the Cardinals game, the Bills did have to come back, but this is a core right now on defense, especially with all the injuries piled up. Ravens were going to have to expose the run, and obviously John Harbaugh, there's just never really any doubts about whether or not he is able to take advantage. I know a lot of people were sort of on offensive coordinator Todd Monken for the way that the AFC Championship game went down last year. I think that Monken has done an excellent job up to this point in the season. You look at sort of the different elements they have, the misdirection from their offensive line and in that running game, to be able to have levels to that. I mean, it just feels so unfair having Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry in a backfield together from a rushing standpoint. And then again, Lamar, he is a much more improved passer than I think a lot of people do want to actually give him credit for over the course of, I'd specifically call it from the start of last season. I think he's been very good in the passing game, but obviously, running is his strength, and it's the identity that the Ravens want to fulfill at this point. I can double-check the stats. I looked it up earlier this morning. Ravens, once again, easily the best rushing offense in the NFL up to this point in the season. 220 yards per game through 4 games. That is just about 45 more yards per game than the second best team, which is the Packers there. So obviously, Ravens, they are confident in who they are once again, and this is just something that I think is going to only continue to get better moving forward here. On the Bills side of this game, like I mentioned, defense definitely worn down, so it's not surprising to me that the Ravens were able to run all over them. What I wasn't expecting is really a lack of a passing game. And Josh Allen was the MVP runner through the first 3 weeks. I haven't checked the odds since then. I'd imagine he's still up there, but probably dinged a little bit since then. And with this game in mind, and I don't think that Josh Allen was necessarily bad in this game. 16 of 29, 180 yards. It was pretty underwhelming, all things considered, but I think sort of when I went and I watched this game, it was more so to me about the fact that Josh Allen was trying to play a little bit more patient and not have to be a little bit of the extreme Josh Allen who's running around with his head on fire, making plays downfield, but also happening to make mistakes. I think that Allen came into this game, all things considered, pretty relaxed, pretty in control. The issue is nothing was really opening up for him. And then as the game progressed, we saw him starting to play more aggressive. And you saw it really from the first possession of the second half for the Bills, where Josh Allen was under pressure, running out of bounds on 3rd and 5. And he ends up basically, again, as he's running out of bounds, somehow find Khalil Shakir wide open all the way down the field, so ends up picking up 52 yards there, and that was in a moment where the Bills really needed him, considering a 3-and-out to start the second half might have felt detrimental. Obviously, they end up getting blown out anyways, but That was a situation where Allen, you see the upside with it. Then it was sort of shortly later where the Bills were starting to regain momentum. And this is maybe a little bit on Josh Allen, but also on the play calling there. Joe Brady, if I'm not mistaken, is the offensive play caller for the Bills at this point. Yeah, he is. So a terrible play call in my opinion, where it did seem like the Bills were starting to, make up some of that momentum, and then all of a sudden they do this ridiculous play where they split out Josh Allen to the left, they have him reverse around, and it ends up resulting in Josh Allen fumbling and getting leveled along the way there. And that was sort of when the game was lost, in my opinion, in that third quarter. I really don't know what the panic button there was, why the reasoning for that call was. Obviously felt like they needed some sort of a spark. I thought that the game was sort of shifting back in their direction. And then, once the fumble occurs there, Bills get knocked off a peg. The Ravens just able to sort of ground and pound their way in for another touchdown. And that really was when the game was pretty much over for them. But I don't think that this is any sort of a panic button game for the Bills. I mean, they were sort of due to be humbled to some degree, and that is a very tough Ravens team on the other end, that both of these teams are probably have the inkling that they may face one another again later this season in the playoffs. So it's not like it's an embarrassing loss from the Bills' perspective of, being knocked off by a team like the Ravens, but the fashion in which it happened is sort of a look into the Bills lost a lot of talent from last season to this year. You obviously don't have the game-breaking receivers of Stephon Diggs and Gabe Davis, and game-breaking is maybe a little bit, overly complimentary. In terms of, what Gabe Davis really was. He was a big play potential guy, though, and Stephon Diggs is obviously Stephon Diggs. He's having a very nice season for himself in Houston right now, that there really aren't those game-breaking types of players. So it is so much on the shoulders of Josh Allen, and when you sort of put Josh Allen into a corner like that, that's when you start to get the erratic nature of him and the Buffalo Bills. So again, Bills, I think they'll be fine. This isn't, to say that they can't compete with the best in the NFL, but I do feel like this did sort of show some of the flaws. And again, injuries, of course, on the side of the Bills as well played a factor in this. But I think that it is kind of clear that there is a discrepancy between the Bills' talent level and the likes of the Ravens in the league. And so I want to finish this off with sort of circling back around to the Ravens one last time in terms of talking about what their identity is now. In the first couple weeks, especially during that Chiefs game, I think is when it was most prevalent, but it was a situation for the Ravens where I really didn't like the balance that we were seeing between Derrick Henry. Just didn't feel all that involved in the offense, where anytime it was an obvious passing situation or even a semi-obvious passing situation, Derrick Henry wasn't on the field, which is obviously because he is not the receiving threat that is Justice Hill. But we're starting to at least see Henry be able to hold his own in certain passing situations. He had something like a 23-yard gain on a screenplay last week, and this week he ends up being a little bit more involved. He catches a touchdown, his first receiving touchdown since 2019. So again, just the fact that he's not a total liability there, that the Ravens aren't so one-dimensional. Just in some of those 50-50 situations, Henry just being present in the backfield can be a difference maker for the Ravens, because it sort of forces opposing defenses to step up more. So that's something that I really liked seeing, a little bit of the development there. And then also credit Justice Hill as well, who is a very good receiving back. You saw in the third quarter on one of their touchdown drives, it was a 3rd and long situation. Hill gets the ball out in the flats and ends up shaking a couple defenders to pick up a first down and put them in the red zone. So I think that the balance that they're striking between Derrick Henry and Justice Hill is great. let's be real, this Ravens team, specifically on the offensive side of the ball, it is about the running ability with them, whether that be who's lined up in the backfield, who they have on the front line. I'll also mention as well the fact that their left guard, Andrew Voorhees, he was out for this game, and they were still able to control the line of scrimmage. Patrick McCary taking that left guard spot, moving over from right tackle. Roger Rosengarten, the rookie, he ends up starting there. Had a little bit of a mixed bag at times, but overall the offensive line looked good. The running game looked incredible, and that is how the Ravens are going to have success. And then on top of that, you mentioned defensively, they were able to sort of lock up Josh Allen in the passing game. The secondary was maybe a little bit of a question, and they responded very well in this game. So I am more than anything just impressed with the Ravens. The Bills maybe a little bit more who we thought they were coming into the season, but still also a very good team. But let me know what your takeaways were from that game, as I want to sort of switch gears to the other top team in the AFC, obviously the team that both the Bills and the Ravens are hoping to, really have themselves compared to, and that is the Kansas City Chiefs, who, listen, you can argue none of the wins have been all that convincing just yet, but the Chiefs are 4-0, pull out another game where they had to overcome some obstacles. So I want to dive into this game in particular, talk about the Rashee Rice injury as well. So a bunch to touch on there, but before we do so, we do have to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh, I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, as we're now going to be diving into the win this past weekend from the Kansas City Chiefs, as the now two-time defending champion Kansas City Chiefs, or back-to-back I should say, are off to another very hot start, at least in the wins and losses column. A lot of people aren't sold on the Chiefs because they haven't been extremely convincing yet up to this point in the season, but good, bad, or ugly, they are pulling out these games. This past week, it was against the Los Angeles Chargers, who are a super beat-up team. It is definitely disappointing that it wasn't a little bit more convincing when you have the opposing quarterback and Justin Herbert dealing with that high ankle sprain. It was clear that he was definitely not 100%. Both of their offensive tackles to protect that injured quarterback were out in this game, and Rashawn Slater and Joe Alt, and then missing some of their best defensive players, Joey Bosa due to an injury, Derwin James due to a suspension, that it would have felt a lot better for the Chiefs to come out against a team that they are clearly better than from a roster-for-roster standpoint, especially considering the key inactives. But instead, a very slow start offensively, and really it is tied into the fact that their blossoming young receiver in Rashee Rice goes down with an injury that is being speculated to be a torn ACL. He was carted off of the field in the first quarter after a collision with Patrick Mahomes after an interception, and I do usually defend if you're losing your number one weapon, because genuinely that's what I think Rice has been up to this point in the season, and maybe playoffs would have been a different story. But Rashee Rice moving forward this year was the plan to be the true number one option for them. But seems like he might be out for the remainder of the season, which would be a huge blow. Anytime that I feel like within game you lose your number one option, it can tend to having a lot of stumbling. We've seen that with the 49ers a couple times within the past calendar year. It was late last year, or it was early last year against the Browns in their week 5 potentially matchup, and then it was in their playoff game early on against the Packers when Deebo Samuel went out. So it's not, unheard of, and I don't want to make too many excuses, but either way, it is a brutal blow. Both it was in the moment for them and long term. Now, if you are going to look at a little bit more of the positive end, at least we saw some of the Chiefs' other pass catchers step up in the absence of Rashee Rice. And they're the ones where the Chiefs were hoping that eventually they would be coming around anyway, is Travis Kelce and Xavier Worthy. Now, it took a little bit of time for that Chiefs offense to really come around. 2 early turnovers, both a Carson Steele fumble on the first drive, and then that Mahomes interception sort of helped kick things off in a slow manner for this Chiefs offense. But eventually, Kelce ended up having his best game of the season up to this point. 7 receptions for 89 yards. Super encouraging to see him, especially now. He is probably going to, once again, have to be the number one weapon and playmaker on the Chiefs offense now with Rashee Rice out. And then Xavier Worthy as well had made a couple big plays for them. It was a 54-yard touchdown where he was able to get behind the Chargers defense and score on a deep shot there. In terms of, everybody has sort of made the comparisons of Xavier Worthy to Tyreek Hill in terms of giving Mahomes that burner deep threat. That's what Worthy proved to be in this moment. So he's had a couple of those explosive downfield touchdowns, even if there may be defensive breakdowns as well. Still got to give Worthy credit for being the speedster that he is. And that's an element that I'm sure the Chiefs are really hoping to be able to incorporate more regularly into their game. And then he came up big on a third down conversion as well. That was sort of a similar play to the one where he came up short on against the Falcons just last Sunday night in that game, where he didn't run through his route. Mahomes overthrew him. This time, Rice continued to drag all the way across, and Mahomes hit him there. So, again, some big plays for Worthy as well. Now, that being said, the Chiefs losing Rice, even still, haven't looked like all that menacing of a team, in large part because of the fact that Patrick Mahomes still hasn't looked great yet up to this point in the season. That interception that he had on the Rashee Rice play was just a really bad throw, which has been, again, you're allowed to have some mistakes, obviously, in the NFL, but it's just been so uncharacteristic of the bad interceptions that Mahomes has thrown, whether he's just not reading defenses right, his touch on the ball, and this one, he just completely airmailed a pass over Travis Kelce. So this is a situation where, their own self-inflicted mistakes are the reason why these games have been closer than they should be. I mentioned, Worthy not being able to convert on that third down last week gave the Falcons a chance to potentially win that game. In this game, the Chargers, it was more early in the game. The Chargers got 10 points off of the Chiefs' turnovers in that first quarter. But, this is a situation where you feel like it should correct itself with Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid, and I personally would bet on them being able to correct it and stop seeing sort of the really negative plays out of this Chiefs offense. But it's definitely something to consider as well. And, we talked about injuries to Rashee Rice as well. That is, coming off of last week where they ended up losing, or 2 weeks ago now, when they lost Isaiah Pacheco, who could be out 6 weeks. He could be out longer. We still don't have a lot of details on where that is currently at. And in this game, you saw, like I mentioned, Carson Steele fumbles on the first drive of the game. Really, they didn't use them all that much after that. Part of the reason being that Kareem Hunt from free agency, who they just signed earlier this week, wasn't just active for them, but ended up being their leading rusher, 14 carries for 69 yards. So it's interesting to consider. Obviously, there's a lot of baggage there with Kareem Hunt, but in terms of just a football perspective, he once was in, all NFL running back for the Chiefs. I don't know if he actually officially made an all-pro team, but an unbelievable rookie season where he was a Pro Bowler, did not be selected to all-pro, but still led the NFL in rushing yards with over 1,308 touchdowns. So this is somebody that we know there is talent there. Now at this point, we're talking 7 years later. So that's a lot longer. It feels at least like a lot longer even in running back years to now, where you're at when you're 22 versus when you're 29. But all things considered, Kareem Hunt did do a pretty good job in this game for them. Now, it's a little bit discouraging to me knowing that their backup option in Carson Steele already seems like, I don't know if it was that he was in the doghouse. I mean, he was still getting snaps for the Chiefs, but, when they were really moving the ball, it was Kareem Hunt and it was also Samaje Perine. So I'm not sure how that dynamic is going to evolve from here. I'm sure that they would probably prefer that Carson Steele is the reliable one for them, but he also has 2 fumbles in the last 3 games now. So that is a tough situation to be in terms of actually being able to fully trust, because Steele, he has the play style that the Chiefs want, and that's just being able to run downhill, quick burst, physical running, but got to be able to hold on to the football in order for that to be a reliable form of offense. Now, again, I think that the Chiefs are going to be fine. They are still the best team in the NFL until proven otherwise, which we just haven't seen yet. Then you have the Bills, of course, on the other end. They were sort of the number 1 team rivaling them for that best team in the NFL spot. They end up getting blown out by the Ravens, so now maybe it's the Ravens that are in that conversation. Either way, I'm just sort of going to stick to my guns until I'm forced to change my mindset, and that is that the Chiefs are the best team, and they're going to continue to figure it out. But again, Rice is a massive loss, especially coming off of losing Pacheco as well. So you're down a couple playmakers, and now you're sort of back where the Chiefs were last season when their offense had so many struggles as well. And they were relying on players that were not coming through for them. The Sky Moores, Marquez Valdez-Scantling, Kadarius Toney. Like, that's just not the situation you want to see the Chiefs reform back to at this point. But we'll see, because now, you still have Kelsey, where we'll see how much sustained success this can be moving forward after having his best game of the season so far. I do feel like part of it, and I'd mentioned this on the show before, that I think part of it was just the idea of getting Rashee Rice a little bit more experience, scheming up for him more so than Kelsey, knowing that Kelsey is going to be a bigger part of the playoff run. Now it feels like he's going to be a bigger part of the regular season push as well. So we will see there. You at least have maybe a little bit more upside from a receiver outside of Kelsey or Rice in Xavier Worthy, that again showed flashes in this game. He's continued to show flashes, especially with the ball in his hands, that he is a little bit of a game breaker. The consistency of him being able to, make plays downfield in that intermediate route. That's why it's so unfortunate, is because I feel like Rice and Worthy sort of played hand in hand, that Rice was able to be the guy sort of intermediate-wise in the middle of the field, and that Worthy could be somebody to stretch the field. Now they're kind of going to need Xavier Worthy to be a little bit closer to the line of scrimmage and making plays there for them, which he could be capable of doing, but it's definitely a change in pace of what the Chiefs were using him as up to this point. Change of pace from what I think is most sustainable at this current point, that I think that Worthy does still have some rounding out of the edges in terms of his route running to be able to be an intermediate guy in the NFL. So we'll see. Ultimately, a win's a win for the Chiefs, and they're going to continue chugging along. But some brutal losses for them early on in the season from an injury perspective could definitely, in the long term, hurt their Super Bowl chances. But let me know in the comments section what your thoughts are on the Chiefs as things currently stand headed into Week 5. But I want to sort of go into another one of these at least perceived top-end teams in the AFC. I don't know if I'm quite there. And that is talking about the New York Jets, who this past week did not score a touchdown as they ended up losing to the Denver Broncos 10-9 at home. It was a weird game in the weather, but were there some real concerns with this Jets offense still that hasn't seemed to be fully functional? We'll be diving into that and more, but first we are going to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, as we're now going to be diving into a disappointing New York Jets loss just yesterday against the Denver Broncos. Against the Denver Broncos. Now, credit off the top to the Broncos, who I think that we're going to, more so focus on the Jets in this, but Vance Joseph and what he has done with this Denver defense has been incredible up to this point, and I do absolutely want to give them their flowers because they are far more competitive of a unit than I was personally anticipating. Now, that being said, this is a game where the Jets allowed 10 points. They're facing a rookie quarterback in Bo Nix in the elements. This was a terrible weather game, and it absolutely had an effect on the results of this game. That being said, though, Jets, it's still a little bit of an inexcusable loss. Coming off of a long week as well, they had played Thursday Night Football in Week 3, so they had that little extra bit of rest coming into this against a rookie quarterback. And again, the defense showed up for them. Bo Nix really did not look comfortable whatsoever. He had finished the first half with -7 passing yards on 7 completions. This is more so a situation where the offense has still just been a lot more dysfunctional than a lot of people were expecting coming into this. Now, I thought that there were going to be moments of clunkiness coming into the year. I wasn't quite as high on the Jets, and it's still a situation where you feel like Rodgers alone is good leadership, depending on what your definition of leadership is, on the football field in terms of getting results and not making mistakes. Rodgers still has the mental capacity to lead the Jets to being a competent offense, but it just hasn't felt great yet up to this point. Now, they looked pretty good, all things considered, against the Patriots on Thursday Night Football in Week 3. Now, the Patriots they're obviously not a very good football team at this point, so do with that what you will, especially considering the fact that the Patriots defense was basically on the field the entire game as well there. So this is a situation where it's a couple different things. The first one I want to point to is the inefficiency from the run game, and specifically with Breece Hall, where I like Breece Hall. He is a very talented running back. Nobody's questioning the talent, but it was definitely on my radar when ESPN put out their polls that they did of coaches, scouts, execs, when they do that every year for top 10 in each position, and Breece Hall came in as the number 2 running back, where Breece Hall, again, very talented. Being put in that conversation, I think, was premature. And he really struggled in this game. 10 carries, just 4 yards on the ground, just 18 total scrimmage yards. I understand part of that is being reflected on the offensive line, but you're seeing situations now, at least to me, this is the second time that we have seen him struggle in short yardage situations so far this season. That was the case against the 49ers in week 1, both at the goal line and on the 3rd and inches that they had, where the Jets really ended up losing that game when they went out on downs. They tried to run Breece Hall up the middle. That didn't work. In this game, you have Breece Hall on 2 goal line opportunities. He isn't able to punch it in. And to his defense, to some degree, I don't think that Breece Hall in the backfield should have been the plan. I like Braylon Allen a lot, maybe too much, but I feel like I would lean with him being that short yardage running back. Again, Breece Hall is excellent in space. He has the acceleration, the breakaway speed, all of that, but I don't think he's a particularly physical running back. He's got good balance, sure, on his feet, but you're just seeing them get stopped short in these situations, and I feel like why wouldn't you give it to your bowling ball of a running back in Braylon Allen, bowling ball in a complimentary way, just to clarify there. But yeah, I thought that this was a really bad game from Breece Hall. It wasn't just the goal line stops. There was also, and weather included, of course, but Breece Hall ended up having a pretty big drop when it was in the 4th quarter, I believe, when they kicked the go-ahead field goal. He was just out in the flats, and it just flat out fell off of his hands. Only brought in 2 of his 5 targets in the passing game as well. Again, I understand the weather being a part of that, but, that's the thing, is I think that Breece Hall was sort of put in conversations for running backs that he wasn't necessarily ready for. And, I'm just going to sort of leave it at that the running game has not been up to the standard that a lot of people were making it up to be headed into this game. We're still sort of waiting on, in the passing game, Aaron Rodgers and Garrett Wilson sort of fully getting on the same page. Wilson had 5 catches for 41 yards in this game, did also have a fumble, so obviously self-inflicted there. But Wilson yet to catch more than 6 passes or top 60 yards in a game. Obviously, for fantasy football owners and just for, NFL fans who know what type of a talent that Garrett Wilson is, we saw him put up results with far worse quarterback play that just still doesn't feel right yet. Now, you have the moments of individual brilliance. We've multiple times in the show talked about the 3rd down conversion that he had in the 4th quarter of that week 2 game against the Titans. There was a moment in this game as well in the 3rd quarter where he had an excellent catch down the sidelines in the 3rd quarter that picked up 23 yards and helped set the Jets up for a field goal then. But it just feels like Rodgers is struggling to really develop much of a chemistry with any of his wide receivers at this current moment. Now, if you want to sort of look a little bit more on the positive side, because I'm not trying to be totally doom and gloom here, one receiver that he did sort of seem to be developing a rapport with was Mike Williams, who was a little bit of an underrated signing, at least to some degree underrated, in the offseason to bring him in. He had 4 catches for 67 yards. Not unbelievable numbers, but season high in receptions and yards. The majority of the plays that he made came later in the game, so he ended up even he had a great catch on the right sideline to set up the field goal right before halftime. That was a big gain there. He drew a pass interference call, which put the Jets in field goal range for that final drive, and then had another 4-yard catch after that. Now, obviously, the Jets end up missing the field goal right as time expires, the 50-yarder, so that is ultimately comes up short. But, Mike Williams, he was at least a prevalent part of the Jets game plan, and I think that he's sort of still working his way back from that ACL tear last year, and he seems to be getting better up to this point. So I think that there are some positives there. I'd also add that, if we're trying to be optimistic for Jets fans, that rookie offensive tackle Olu Fashanu, he looked pretty good in this game, all things considered, starting for the injured Morgan Moses at that right tackle spot. So I think that, you have some real positives there. Is it Morgan Moses that he's starting for? I don't know. Correct me in the comment section if I'm off base there. But this is a situation where Fashanu, they drafted him with the 11th overall pick. They were anticipating that he was going to be a big part of the team. Now they end up bringing in a bunch of other offensive linemen in free agency to be starters there. So, he sort of steps in now. It is Moses that went down. Just had to clarify for myself there. But I think that this is a situation where I feel like you see Fashanu sort of step into the limelight here and hold his own, which I think that, coming into the draft, he was my favorite offensive tackle prospect, and I think that he's doing a pretty good job for himself. So we're going to finish up on the Jets. Do very quickly want to address a comment here from Anthony Manzano. He says, quote, "I understand it's his style, but do you feel like it's a mistake for Jim Harbaugh to take the ball away from Justin Herbert when the kid has an elite arm?" Clarify what you mean for taking the ball away from Justin Herbert. I do understand that it's more so about establishing the run game and sort of incorporating that is a big part of the Jim Harbaugh identity. So I assume that's sort of the direction you're talking about with this comment here. I think that, I don't know. At this current moment, no, I wouldn't say it's a mistake because there really aren't that many playmakers on the perimeter for this Chargers team. Now, Ladd McConkey had his best game of his career up to this point in this past game against the Chiefs, so definitely a positive there. But, J.K. Dobbins has really been the playmaker for the Chargers up to this point in the season. The running game has been getting established, and I think that the passing is a little bit secondary right now, which I understand the concerns because, yes, Justin Herbert, I'm with you, an elite arm. One of the best quarterbacks in the league, and obviously has been sort of swept under the rug in those conversations from a national standpoint because of the fact that the Chargers haven't been a super competitive team these past couple years. I also feel like more than anything right now, Herbert is basically running around on one leg. That high ankle sprain, he had the foot injury coming into the season. You look at this game in particular, both of their offensive tackles out, and that's coming off of a game where Justin Herbert was knocked out of the game against the Steelers just a week prior. So I don't think it's a mistake, at least at this point. It's something that they're definitely going to have to reintroduce long term for the Chargers because you can't let that talent of Herbert go to waste. But I do understand at least the approach of where they're coming into this year. You can definitely make the argument it is a mistake, but I feel like, I don't know. I don't think it's cowardly coaching. I think it's understanding the situation where they're currently at, where they are better built for the running game at this moment, and Justin Herbert is very clearly not healthy, that you want to sort of relieve some of the pressure surrounding him. But I guess just sort of final thoughts here on this Jets-Broncos game. Jets, I think it's a situation where they can sort of bounce back in the long term, that, they are still overall a very good roster now that Mike Williams is potentially rearing his head. Maybe that's another element they can sort of add into this whole thing. But I do feel like it's just the offense is not as functional as you would want. Now, we're still only 4 games into the season. It's also a quarter of the year, though. And I just don't know. I wouldn't have a ton of faith on the Jets in the long term for this season. I feel like Aaron Rodgers now, you're seeing him take hits and that, coming up limping a little bit. I do still have concerns there, knocking on wood that nothing happens, but I don't feel extremely confident. Offensive line should be better than they just were. Again, credit to the Denver Broncos. That's now 12 sacks for them in the past 2 games. So again, Vance Joseph, what he's doing with that defense is incredible, but definitely not a great sign there. Brees, just nobody's really living up to expectations at this current moment. And it's obviously a little bit of an, I wouldn't quite say night and day situation, but it's a huge adjustment from last year where they were at and the level of quarterback play they got then to now Rodgers, who can be a little bit stubborn at times as a quarterback, but still is an all-timer and does know what he's doing to the point where I think they'll continue to be competitive on a week-in, week-out basis. They're going to be in that playoff hunt, but I still have a really hard time of considering them true Super Bowl contenders. Now, if you disagree in the comment section, feel free to let me know why. This is, an open-minded conversation here. But, I think that the Jets offense, it's going to take a lot for them to be able to overcome everything we've seen so far. And it's definitely in the cards, but there's too many things right now with that offense that I'm not buying stock in the Jets, especially considering that this is basically a one-year experiment. Maybe Rodgers is able to, squeak out an age 42 season, but, it's kind of where I'm at with them. But again, let me know in the comment section if you disagree. If you are a Jets optimist, feel free to let us know why. But we're going to be moving on here, and I want to talk about the Minnesota Vikings, who continue their undefeated streak through 4 weeks, continue to be one of the biggest surprises. It has to be actually the biggest surprise up to this point. And they go into Lambeau Field and pull off an upset win against the Packers. So I want to dive into that. But before we do so, we do have to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube. Absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, as we're now going to be diving into the Minnesota Vikings, who continue to roll out of the gates. They are now 4-0 with what I would now consider 3 high-profile wins against the 49ers, the Texans, and now the Packers. Sure, there's been a little bit of injury stuff involved in those games, but ultimately still, I think that at this point, you look at, it's not just about the results of them getting wins, it's the process of all of it. Now, this wasn't a perfect game for the Vikings by any means. I mean, they ultimately almost ended up blowing their 28-0 lead that they developed in the first half, but it's still overall, I think, very convincing, and I don't think that there's a ton of abnormalities that are putting the Vikings in this position. The one that you could really point to is Sam Darnold, and is he going to sort of come back down to what our preseason expectations were, which is a fair question that I myself definitely still have to some degree. But overall, this is a very good, talented Vikings team that is extremely well coached, that Darnold, it's not like he has to be, some people want to throw him like MVP, dark horse candidacy. I would be shocked if that were to happen, and I definitely would not bet on that. But that being said, I do think that, he can keep up a level of play of just being good enough to win, and the Vikings are a talented roster to the point where they can continue to rattle these off. So, like I mentioned, they jumped out to a 28-0 lead over the Packers. You saw Jordan Addison, who was playing in his first game of the season, dealing with an injury through the first few weeks, that he was a big part of it, scoring 2 early touchdowns. He just really is the perfect complement to this Vikings offense, where you have Justin Jefferson, who draws so much attention. Quite literally on that first touchdown, he ended up drawing the safety over to his side of the field on the left. Jordan Addison, just one guy to beat, an inexperienced member of the Packers secondary, just puts a little bit of a double move on him and gets behind him for the touchdown there. And then you get the ball in his hands and he just has that explosive ability as well, which is what happened for the jet sweep, where it was Justin Jefferson also making an excellent block on that play. But really, it was just Addison 1v1 against the linebacker, and he shook him and got to the end zone. And that's what he's capable of doing. And again, when you talk about, just sort of getting some of these playmakers back, Jordan Addison, TJ Hawkinson as well, who started the year on the physically unable to perform list. He is now able to be back at practice this week, so he'll be another layer to add into this offense. And so you have, the star and Justin Jefferson, but you have layers to this team. And then that sort of leads me into the other big takeaway that I've had from the Vikings up to this point in the season is now they actually have a running game. Aaron Jones has been an incredible addition for this offense. Last season, the Vikings were 29th in the NFL in rush yards per game with 91.4. This year, they're up to 14th at 123 rush yards per game, which isn't necessarily an elite mark for the Vikings, but it's drastically improved. The offensive line is actually winning their one-on-ones up front as well. And Aaron Jones, he's got that fire to him. Clearly, if you couldn't see it this past week against his former team in the Packers, he just seems so ready to sort of prove himself that I think it's been, sort of one of the more underrated additions in the NFL from this past offseason is it is instantly paying dividends for the Vikings, adding a hard-nosed running back like Aaron Jones to the mix. Because as much as Sam Darnold has been an awesome redemption story up to this point in the year, the Vikings, and whether it was Darnold or J.J. McCarthy, the idea wasn't that it was going to be a quarterback putting the team on its shoulder to having success, where Sam Darnold, he is able to have a little bit more wiggle room because A, he has so many options from a receiver standpoint, and then B, the fact that they're actually able to move the ball up front in front of him. And Darnold, in this game specifically, I thought that he was pretty good. He was great in the beginning as they built up that 28-0 lead, but we saw some cracks in the armor. I do think that he is, at least a decent amount to blame for the Packers even having a shot towards the end of this game, where you look at Darnold in the second half and he has an interception in the red zone to take points off of the board on their first drive of the second half. He ends up having a fumble in their own territory that gives the Packers a short field, and they're able to score a touchdown, immediately in the red zone. That made it a one-score game with 10 minutes left. So, a couple costly turnovers for Darnold. Ultimately, there was enough good that came from him as well. He passed for 275 yards and threw 3 touchdowns. So by no means am I trying to tear Sam Darnold down, but there are realistic expectations for Darnold that he's not going to just all of a sudden be one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL, that he has some flaws. Now, overall, he's been a huge net positive for the Vikings, but if you have hesitations, I do think that that's where it comes from. That being said, on the other side of this, I still am very in on the Packers. And obviously, if you're doing power rankings for where they are currently at, the Vikings, based off of how these two teams are playing, the Vikings have to be in front of the Packers. But this was a game where I thought that ultimately this was a pretty bad game from the Packers. And even still, they ended up losing by just 2 points against one of, if not the hottest team in the NFL to start the season, where it was Jordan Love's first game back from injury, and it did sort of look that way just with some of the inconsistencies. He ended up throwing 3 interceptions. He just didn't look right throughout the game. I thought his touch on the ball was a little bit erratic, was throwing low a little bit to start the game. Then he ended up throwing too high. I think it was to Luke Musgrave or Tucker Kraft. I get those tight ends confused sometimes. But, airmailed the tight end for one of his interceptions as well. He threw a little bit of hospital pass as well that ended up getting Christian Watson hurt. So it sounds like as of this morning, it's nothing torn. It's a high ankle sprain, but, sort of put one of his best receivers in a really bad position in the middle of the field, throwing into traffic then. So this was not a good Jordan Love game. That being said, even in a game that isn't good for Jordan Love, he threw for 389 yards and 4 touchdowns, which is just kind of why I think that this is going to be all right for the Packers. Now, losing Watson for a few weeks, that definitely hurts, and I'm sure Jordan Love feels bad about that play in particular. But, Jordan Love, I thought he got more comfortable as the game went on. Either way, the fact that they did get put in such a deficit, it's a lot to ask your quarterback returning from injury to throw 54 passes in their first game. So I think that ultimately he's going to be able to work his way back. You see Jaden Reed, who continues to really impress, in my opinion. He ends up, he's really emerging as the number one for this team. 7 receptions, 139 yards, and a touchdown in this game. He and Love ended up linking up for a pretty impressive touchdown pass at one point as well, where Love just sort of floated it out to the right for Reed to go up and get it. So I think a lot of positives there for the Packers, even in what was, I think, a bad game. Now, that's also without Jair Alexander, the star cornerback, who ended up getting ruled out just a couple hours before the game. So this is a situation where Packers, they're 2-2, they end up losing this game. A lot of people are going to be sort of off the scent of them a little bit, but I still feel really good about them moving forward this season. I think that ultimately, it was more so the Vikings' self-inflicted wounds that let the Packers back into this game. But it makes me think that, the Packers are going to still be in a very solid position. Now, looking at the NFC North as a whole right now, just very quickly here to end off this segment, I think it's really interesting looking at what is maybe the most complete division in the NFL. You can make an argument for the AFC North depending on where you're at with the Browns. I still feel like it's the NFC North that overall, top to bottom, is the best collection of talent. And as things stand now, the Detroit Lions are going to be playing the Seahawks tonight. So we'll see. I think this is a little bit of not a full prove-it spot for the Lions, but sneakily a really big game for them, who I don't think that they've been all that convincing up to this point yet in the season. And it would be really good to see, after the amount of financial investment that they sort of rolled out this past offseason between Jared Goff and Penei Sewell and Amon-Ra St. Brown, and just spending across the board, that they do sort of shape into who we think they're going to be. I think they will be okay, but again, a little bit of a pivotal spot here on Monday Night Football. Either way, the Vikings are going to head into Week 5 with the top spot in the NFC North. You look at the Chicago Bears, who were able to pull out a win as well against the Los Angeles Rams yesterday. That this is a very competitive, division, top to bottom, even still. And the Vikings are now in a position where they have the high ground. Now, I don't know what the odds are. I'd be actually curious to see if we can pull them up super quick, if we still have time for that. But what the odds would be for who is going to win that division, because I would probably still lean with the Lions. But the Vikings now, again, have a little bit of ground. Now, going to be a tough couple weeks for them, where this upcoming week they are going to be headed to London to face the Jets then, and that's a little bit of an interesting game. And actually, I forgot, they do have a bye week, Week 6, and they'll be able to head into a game at home against the Lions off of a bye week. That, if the Vikings can pick up these next 2 wins, I think that's when we are getting in the very realistic territory of the Vikings can win the NFC North. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comments section, as we are going to continue to talk NFL throughout the week. Still a whole bunch of games that I want to dive into. Tomorrow we're going to be specifically getting into the NFC East as well. The Eagles, who suffered a big loss. The Commanders, who might just be the best team in that division all of a sudden. That we're going to dive into that. But to finish off the show today, we have to talk about the news that broke on Friday, and that is that the Knicks are acquiring All-Star center Karl-Anthony Towns as they continue to invest into this core and have championship aspirations. So we are going to be diving into that situation, but before we do so, we do have to take our final break of the show. So stick with us, and we will be right back. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast for our final segment of the day, where we are going to be now breaking down what is a blockbuster deal that technically has not been finalized, at least as of when we were heading into this show. But the deal largely is expected to contain the Knicks acquiring All-Star center Karl-Anthony Towns in exchange for Julius Randle, Dante DiVincenzo, and a first-round pick from the Pistons. That sounds like Bobby Marks reported that it was going to be top 13 protected. Still, a lot of minor details that have to be ironed out there. Again, nothing finalized quite yet. But it sounds like this deal is on track to go through at this point. There's really no going back for either one of these franchises. So I would largely expect it to happen. And, just a week left in the offseason. Preseason is right around the corner. And we get, for the second year in a row, a blockbuster deal in those final days. Last season, it was Damian Lillard to the Bucks. This year, Karl-Anthony Towns to the Knicks. So I think that I want to start at this from sort of a general perspective of really weird timing, it feels like, for this trade to go down, considering that it is a week into the a week until the preseason begins. The Knicks feel like they're in a position where, yes, they are going to be ultra competitive for the season, and Karl-Anthony Towns being an all-star center that's on the market for them, center being their number one need, feels like a situation that they can't pass up on, but they're very restricted now in terms of what they can and can't do from here. On the Timberwolves side, to not even sort of play into next season after you just made the Western Conference Finals probably a year before anticipated, I understand the long-term implications of what it would have meant for the Timberwolves to keep Cat on the books and to have three centers making, as much money as they would be between Gobert, Naz Reid, and Karl-Anthony Towns. That's not sustainable. But to not even give it a shot this upcoming season feels weird. Now, that being said, I don't necessarily hate the roster for roster move of, I guess we'll lean into the Timberwolves here first. They get Julius Randle back along with DiVincenzo. The reality is, I think that Julius Randle is a very flawed basketball player, as is Karl-Anthony Towns in my opinion. That Randle is a downgrade. I don't think it's the worst thing in the world, though, to go out and get someone in Randle who, yes, again, flawed, has his issues. He can go get you a bucket. And that's just something Karl-Anthony Towns, ultra competitive, but last season specifically, and I know Cat did have his huge scoring outburst against the Hornets that, in that game against the Charlotte Hornets of all teams, that, yeah, he can go get you buckets, but he's not somebody that, in my opinion, is going to consistently take the ball into his hands and go make something happen, where Julius Randle, he can do that. Now, it'll probably take him a good 12 seconds to do so out of that isolation to be able to put up a shot, but the Timberwolves definitely last year, you saw it in the playoffs, were so reliant on just Anthony Edwards going and getting buckets for them that I think it is very difficult, especially in today's NBA with the amount of talent that there is, to single-handedly run through one player. And Karl-Anthony Towns, for a lot of the playoffs, was pretty underwhelming. Not just from a scoring perspective, but obviously he doesn't bring you much on the defensive side of the ball. Some of the irrational fouls that he has are inexplicable. And I think that Randle is actually a good player, a much better player than what his public reputation would tell you. The fact that he can go get you buckets. He is a positive defender. He is one of, if not the best, rebounding non-centers in the NBA. And there are positive aspects to his game. Now, the spacing between, you look at Gobert, Randle, and Jaden McDaniels as sort of your front court, that's pretty tough. That is definitely not ideal, but I also think that there's roster flexibility in there, adding in a Dante DiVincenzo, who is a great shooter. I think they could very easily play lineups as well with DiVincenzo at the 2, Anthony Edwards at the 3, and then if you want spacing as well, you can go Julius Randle at the 4 and then Naz Reid at the 5, because Naz Reid, that's the thing, is I feel like in this situation with the Timberwolves, they couldn't continue to have their 3 most expensive players be centers in Naz Reid, Rudy Gobert, and Karl-Anthony Towns. That now I think they can throw out a number of different lineups. And I think as well there's a lot of depth even from there as well, where I am a very big fan of a Rob Dillingham. I like Terrence Shannon Jr. as well, the 2 rookies that they took in the first round of this year. They have a Joe Ingles sneakily off the bench for a little bit of spacing there as well. Nickeil Alexander-Walker is a pretty good shooter as well. So I don't think that it's quite as bad from a spacing perspective as people make it out to be. It's not great. It's clunky in some areas for sure, but I don't think that this is a bad deal. And the idea that the Timberwolves got fleeced is a little bit ridiculous, because what really was the market for Karl-Anthony Towns? I don't think it was much more than, an all-NBA caliber player, a really good role player, and a potential first-round pick. That overall, it's a pretty solid return, all things considered. Now, part of the issue with this is that the Timberwolves, and it's an issue with them, but it's also just reality, is they're going into a situation where they have a lot of uncertainties at the ownership position, and they're going through a sale there, and it becomes really difficult to navigate all of that when they're also very much in the luxury tax threshold, and you have, now an expiring contract in Julius Randle gives you more roster flexibility. I don't know. Ultimately, I think it's fine for the Timberwolves. I don't think they got worse. I don't think that now they're a tier lower than they were before. Now, I want to talk about the Knicks as well, because that's obviously the whole second half of this equation, is that the Knicks have continued this offseason to go out and spend and add a lot of talent, which they successfully did, where you bring in Mikal Bridges, Karl-Anthony Towns, and even if you want to go back to the trade deadline last year, you had OG Anunoby as well. And ultimately, they didn't give up a ton necessarily. Yeah, they gave up a bunch of draft picks to go get Mikal Bridges, but really it's not like they were selling off any young known quantities that are going to be really good players. In the Anunoby deal, they sent out RJ Barrett and Emmanuel Quickley that some people are really high on. I think it was a no-brainer of a deal as long as Anunoby is able to stay healthy. And Karl-Anthony Towns now kind of slides in perfectly to that role where you get a center, which they desperately needed because Hartenstein leaves in free agency. Mitchell Robinson is still dealing with that foot injury that he suffered in the playoffs when Embiid got tangled up with him in the first round. And so he's going to be out for at least 3 months. We don't really know exactly what that means. Could be longer, could be shorter. It's a risky game to play, though, of gambling on that. So you go out and you get a known quantity in Karl-Anthony Towns where he's flawed, like I mentioned, as was Julius Randle. That Towns, like I mentioned, the stupid fouls with him, the defensive shortcomings. But I think he comes into a situation here with the Knicks where Anunoby and Bridges can make up for some of that wing / a little bit of post defense that, specifically Anunoby, probably Bridges as well, can for the most part guard 1 through 5. I think that they can contribute rebounding wise. Josh Hart, obviously one of the best rebounders in the league for like a size to rebounding ability perspective, just 6'4", but is always up there in terms of rebounds per game. That I think I like the move a lot in terms of the cohesiveness with a starting lineup. What I will say is the fit in terms of the sacrifice to the bench, and now with Tom Thibodeau, and he's back with Karl-Anthony Towns. Didn't exactly have a great relationship first time around in Minnesota. That's a little bit weird to me. Again, you look at the bench now, and it's Miles McBride, who was really good down the second half of last season. Hopefully I'm sure to at least some degree they feel like they can continue to build upon that. But then outside of that, Mitchell Robinson's a good defensive center when he's available to them. He can help out with rebounding as well for, specific situations like that. There's just not a ton of talent off of that bench, in my opinion. And I think that things could definitely get dicey there, especially for a Tom Thibodeau coach team that is going to be very reliant on that starting lineup. And it's a good thing if everybody stays healthy, of course, but you're talking running the risk with an OG Anunoby especially, who has an extensive injury history, that you could really easily find yourselves having to go out and start a Precious Achiuwa once again, or maybe a Deuce McBride. And I think that they are very razor thin. They are also very expensive for the time being, under the second luxury tax cap for this season, but they are only going to continue to get more expensive from here on out, where Karl-Anthony Towns, his contract is going to continue to get more expensive, as with OG Anunoby. Eventually, they're going to have to pay Mikal Bridges. So this is a very good roster, one of the best starting fives in basketball. I would still take the Celtics starting five over the Knicks in this situation. But that being said, I do think that there are some real roster flaws on each of these teams right now, which is why ultimately I would consider this trade a win-win, because I can see the perspectives from both sides, and I think they are both going to be very competitive in this upcoming season. But I think that there are also very clear issues with both of the deals, especially when you're talking about some of the long-term implications. And I also, my least favorite part is it does feel almost a little bit cowardly with the Timberwolves to sell as early as they did. But like I mentioned, I'm also not convinced that this definitively makes them a worse team. I think that they could be better, by some stretch of the imagination, if Julius Randle ends up giving you a productive season with the spacing that Dante DiVincenzo provides to you. I think that this is overall in that win-win category. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section. That is all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for tuning into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Remember to like, follow, subscribe wherever you may be keeping up with us. Be sure to check us out on social media as well for more exclusive short content. And we will be back tomorrow afternoon, same time as always, at 2 o'clock p.m. Eastern. We will see you then. Take care.
Mm-hmm. 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 it's gonna be a bad day.